military vaccines and a wave of lawsuits that we are about to see. We are just starting to see a wave of lawsuits around vaccine mandates. Of course, we showed you the Canadian vaccine mandate lawsuits that are starting to unfold. Get ready for a flood of them in the United States. We're seeing more around healthcare workers, of course, in the United States, but get ready for an onslaught of lawsuits around military mandates for vaccines that cost people in the military their pensions, their livelihoods, when they opted to not take the vaccine. Sort of a blanket policy, right? And even like religious exemptions. No, if you had an issue, if you had some sort of an allergy, to certain mechanisms inside of the vaccine, and you knew this ahead of time from doing your own research, sorry, too bad, bye-bye. You're going to leave, and you're not going to get your pension. You're not going to be taken care of in perpetuity. And by the way, you'll be dishonorably discharged on top of that. Through no fault of your own, you just don't want this emergency use authorization vaccine that hasn't been fully vetted yet. My choice, my body, but no.
So that's a part of the story I did not know they were dishonorably discharging those guys. Like that's horrible, because they can't. If you're dishonorably discharged, you can't get loans. Like it's hard to get loans. It's hard to do anything once you get out with a dishonorable discharge.
I think that's the term for it, right? I think that's they're not getting honorably discharged. Is there a middle road? They were considering between dishonorably and there was like a middle one.
I think there's probably honorably and then just discharged and then dishonorably. So it's probably you're just discharged.
So
I'll
Craig
look into
Thomas
that more
says
because that just seems.
Craig Thomas says it's not dishonorable. It's the other one that's not honorable. So it's no benefits. Oh, it's a general discharge. Okay, general discharge. Excuse me. Thank you for that correction. So
you probably have honorable, general, and dishonorable.
So with general, no benefits. But at least you still have the honor of going and getting a loan, I guess, in other places. But you're not dishonorably like you went AWOL, okay? You ran away from base or something like that. Okay, glad we cleared that up. So what is interesting, though, is that if you have these mandates in place, you would think that these things are in place for a reason, right? That they are there to protect the military. That they are there to protect the United States Armed Forces. That's the purpose of this, right? That's why we have these mandates. That's what they were telling us. So here we've known about the adverse effects from these vaccines for years now. And we specifically knew of the adverse effects on soldiers back in 2021. Here's a report. Let me go back to this. Was Congress grilling General Milley and Lloyd Austin about mandates back in 2022 in April of this year, wanting to know, why are we still doing this? What is the benefit here? And here was Mark Milley's response. Watch.
March 18th, the U.S. Army discharged 3 soldiers, the first time it has booted troops for failing to comply with the COVID-19 vaccine mandate. It's projected that 2,692 soldiers, the size of a couple of Army battalions, have not taken the vaccine and will likely be separated from the Army. Once again, how is this loss of personnel going to hurt the overall end strength of the Army?
I think if 2,000 are kicked out, I think that would hurt. But I think there's a issue of education here and persuasion and making sure that these soldiers are making informed decisions.
As of March 3rd, Army commanders have relieved a total of 6 regular Army leaders, including 2 battalion commanders, and issued 3,183 general officer written reprimands to regular Army soldiers for not taking the vaccination. How has this loss of leadership and focus on administrative burdens improved Army warfighting readiness and enhanced combat power?
Well, again, Congressman, I think that the idea of the health of the force, the readiness of the force, and getting a vaccination is a contributing factor to that, I think is fundamental to the overall readiness of the force. So I regret that commanders are getting relieved for things like that. I didn't know the numbers that you mentioned. I'll go back to the Army and get the actual data. But we are an institution that has a whole set of requirements in terms of the health of the force and shots and et cetera. And there's a policy, and our job is to enforce the policy.
Oh.
Thank you. I yield back.
Okay. So it's all about the health and wellness of the force, right? That's what he's telling us in April of this year. And yet you literally, like recruitment numbers are way down. So what is it then? What is the health and wellness of the force when we have recruitment numbers way down and they're having to give out $50,000 sign-up bonuses because they can't attract people at the Army level? But it's for the health and wellness of the force. If the health and wellness of the force is security and strength in numbers, then what the hell's happening here? You're literally saying we'd rather have this draconian mandate in place, which is driving members of the military out, rather than having the numbers that we need to be a strong, effective military. We've known about the adverse effects, by the way, of these vaccines. So you're lying right to our faces, General Milley. We've known about the adverse effects for years. So what you're doing is you're admitting that by giving these to soldiers, you have a potential to actually weaken your force. Specifically, we knew of the adverse effects of myocarditis on soldiers back in 2021. Here's a military report highlighting myocarditis in military members. Watch.
From January through the end of April, the military administered 2.8 million doses of the vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna. A new study describes how 23 service members later developed chest pain and sought medical attention. Tests showed it was myocarditis.
Myocarditis is an inflammation of the heart muscle. And typically, this is seen in response to an infection.
Dr. Christian Ramers is with Family Health Centers of San Diego.
There's like 15 or 20 common offenders. Things like chickenpox can do it. Things like enteroviruses that cause infections in kids can do it.
Last week, the CDC said there was a likely link between a few hundred cases of heart inflammation and the vaccines, and the military study adds more evidence. They found all 23 cases were in men. All happened within 4 days of vaccination, and most happened after the second dose. When the researchers broke down the numbers after the second dose, they say they'd expect to find between 0 and 8 cases of myocarditis from other causes. Instead, they found 19.
Oh, so they knew this. It was in the data. They were fully aware of it. Now we're seeing, according to Epoch Times, legal challenges to the Pentagon's vaccine mandate just getting started, according to military insiders. The Department of Defense's requirement that all members of the armed forces receive vaccinations, even if they've already had the virus, developed immunity, has had a severely disruptive effect within military ranks, resulting in the denial of promotions and assignments to those who refused vaccination, and in thousands of service members having to leave the military. The vaccination order has given rise to a spat of lawsuits. Spate? Would you say spate of lawsuits? Spat? I say spate. Spate. It's a good word, spate. And is likely to spur more challenges as more people come to see that officials who grant exemptions on other grounds are unwilling to accommodate those who file religious accommodation requests. I have talked to military members, and no one likes this policy. No one thinks it's a good idea. I agree with them that this policy is going to backfire in a big way. It's going to force out people who are moral, ethical service members out of the military and will leave a readiness gap. But the other problem is that a relatively untested vaccine, and we're all just now starting to see what the health effects are. Now, one of the things, I don't know if you guys remember this, but do you remember the concerns about members of the military in Iraq who were in confined spaces and were then, as a result of that, suffering deep vein thrombosis and other issues and having major health issues and dying? And now we know one of the effects of these things is developments of blood clots. And so having a military force readiness or in field who are, in trenches, we're seeing trench warfare unfolding all throughout the Ukraine conflict right now, being in close quarters in tanks and other military vehicles, HIMARS vehicles and other things for long periods of time. We know the adverse effects of those blood clots. Do you guys remember that? I remember that very vividly. Being shoved inside of tanks, and there were all sorts of concerns about these blood clots in their legs. And there was even concerns then about vaccines having been given to them as they were entering war zones. And there was concerns that maybe these blood clots, maybe there's a connection here between this. The vaccine mandate has been enshrined in DoD policy as a consequence of Biden's 2019 or 2021 order to a list of required vaccinations. Secretary Lloyd Austin's subsequent memorandum on 2021 required each branch of the military to vaccinate all service members. So you're going to see a number of a number of lawsuits that are going to unfold around this. There's already a couple of them have come forward. There was a few. There's like two that came forward about 4 months ago that are moving through. So labeling is a legal requirement in order to have a licensed product. You can't waiver proper labeling. This amounts to fraud labeling, which has its own statute law. And they knew what they did was illegal because they said many vaccines were forced on service personnel before May 20th, 2022. Were not, how do you say this? Commodity labeled?
Camaraderie?
No.
Oh.
Corminati labeled, and hence did not meet a fundamental legal obligation. So we've already seen a lawsuit now emerging because of this, because these things weren't labeled properly and they didn't have the proper legal labeling from Pfizer, BioNTech, and these others, that because of that, they're almost like fraudulent labeling. So this could be the entry point now for members of the military to start suing over these things.
There's a military physician that testified during one of Ron Johnson's hearings that he had in Congress. You can only find it on Rumble, but if you go Google or go to Rumble and search out Ron Johnson and look at his channel, you'll see it. And she kind of goes through every aspect of this from the beginning and to the adverse reactions and the issues with soldiers denying it and stuff. It's really, really great interview, but you kind of got to seek it out. You won't find it on Google.
Well, I'll check it out. Another piece of this, of course, is the religious exemptions, right? Which is many military personnel saying, hey, we're not going to sit still on this. We were forced out. Last week, 14 Marines residing in the state of Texas, Washington State, Louisiana, Minnesota, North Carolina filed a class action lawsuit in federal court against Secretary Austin. In their complaint, the plaintiffs are citing sincerely held religious beliefs, claiming that military officials have been inconsistent in their treatment of service members seeking exemptions. And so, again, this is what led to the religious exemptions piece, is what led to some effective lawsuits unfolding. And we're going to see some of this among healthcare professionals specifically. Maybe it's like the adverse effects piece of this, because these companies, these pharmaceutical companies, have these protections in place with the federal government. They have immunity, but they don't have immunity from religious exemptions, and the federal government doesn't. So I think we may see an additional spate of lawsuits around religious exemptions tied to this. It's going to be really fascinating. And then not just there, you'll see it in professional sports. You're going to see it in all sorts of different companies, and you're going to start to see precedents being laid across the country with these lawsuits as we get more information about this. And boy, I cannot wait to start to see some of the discovery that unfolds during these lawsuits. Either they're going to settle these things, right? They'll settle these things so that you don't have to see the discovery. You don't have to see the documents. But if they go to trial, if they're preparing for trial, they're going to go through discovery. And then we're going to get to see the stuff that they've been hiding about these things.
Well, I think the risk, those risk mitigators, they're going to do as much as they can to make sure none of this comes to light. So I guarantee there's going to be a lot of backdoor settlements and stuff just so that, because imagine if the stuff does come out, they go into the trial process, then it's going to set a precedent, and there's going to be a lot more lawsuits.
Right. Yeah. I think, yes. But because if people get their hands on this, they know what's through discovery. That's going to open up a whole a can of whoop ass. Like other lawsuits are going to pop up, and they're going to start to see that stuff. Absolutely the case.